friends, welcome to episode 5 of The Fairy Tale Thief. I hope you're following along in the book. You can find the book for free on Amazon. If you enjoy listening to me read stories, I hope you hit the subscribe button and the like and leave a comment. Thanks. Here we go, episode 5. In Salmondale, the leaves would be golden brown. A crisp wind would be reminding everyone that winter rains would soon fall. But in Santa Magdalena, a hot wind blew in off the desert, and the dying sun settled over the circus, raising a steamy warmth that mingled with pungent animal smells, the scent of popcorn, and the faint perfume of makeup grease. Amy, Gabby, and Grace wound past hordes of children, parents, and a wandering clown, and candy-striped cages of lions and elephants. Horses adorned with enormous and elaborate headgear shook their manes as Grace made her way to the carousel, where painted ponies bounced in rhythm. She felt more queasy than brave. Despite the security guards patrolling the grounds and Chase and Oliver lurking somewhere close, she found it difficult to breathe normally. Where were the dwarfs? Even though it seemed as if most of the town was at the circus, there was a really good chance the dwarves wouldn't show. They seemed to be everywhere she didn't want them to be, and now that she wanted them, now that she was ready to confront them, where were they? Behind the curtain of the big top, the ringmaster's voice boomed while tinny, joyful music heralded the beginning of the first show. A line of spectators filed into the tent, while a large crowd milled around the sawdust-strewn grounds. Grace shoved her hands into the pockets of her pig suit to stop herself from wringing them. Why was she so nervous? Where were the dwarfs? Amy and Gabby both turned to watch a guy lead a stallion through a wooden gate. "Giddy up," Amy said, staring. The guy had blonde, shoulder-length hair tied back with a leather thong and wore soft, fawn-colored breeches and matching knee-high boots. His white shirt billowed around like a wide leather belt that hung around his hips. His eyes and the small smile curving his lips sent a jolt of recognition up Grace's spine, although she knew they'd never met. "Hot horse guy," Gabby murmured. The tone of her voice made Grace feel sorry for Chase. "He's totally staring at you, which is not fair. You're not the only one wearing a pig suit." Grace tugged at one of the many nipples lining the Pepto-Bismol pink velour costume. She knew she looked ridiculous, but she'd rather look like Wilbur from Charlotte's Web than spend the $20 entrance fee or stay at home. Gabby, Oliver, and Amy looked equally silly. A passel of porkers, Amy and Oliver's dad had called them. "There's something familiar about him," Grace said under her breath, tearing her gaze away from him. "Don't you think so?" "He's almost too perfect," Amy said. Gabby stopped short. "What's he doing here?" Now her voice had changed, and Grace knew instantly that Gabby was no longer talking about hot horse guy. Oliver and Chase stepped out from behind a popcorn stand. For once, Chase looked bashful. "Wasn't that one of the dwarfs' names?" "Timid," Grace reminded herself. Amy elbowed Gabby. "Just talk to him." Gabby shook her head, and her ponytail swung side to side. "No." "It wasn't his fault," Amy whispered, and all the S's sound like hisses. "My mom," Gabby began. "Yeah, your mom has made mistakes, your dad being the biggest one of them out there," Amy said. "But Chase is a good guy. I've known him my whole life." Gabby balled her fists and placed them on her hips. "Then why was he with Alicia at the beach the other night?" "Wait, Alicia?" Grace interrupted. "Brock's Alicia?" "Alicia belongs to no man," Gabby said. Or all men, Amy added. "Does Brock know?" Grace asked. Gabby smirked and motioned toward the big top. "You should ask him." Grace looked over her shoulder to watch Brock and Alicia standing in line, waiting to file in the main arena. As always, Alicia looked rock star beautiful in her new occult jeans, strappy sandals, and lacy top. She had her arm looped around Brock's. She lifted her chin when her lifted chin told Grace that she'd spotted them, but refused to acknowledge them because they were mere beetles in her own personal dung pile. Amy stood a little taller and smiled a little brighter in a way that she wouldn't do for her brother and his lovesick for Gabby friend. Grace turned to see Hot Horse Guy approaching. Oliver and Chase also must have noticed him because their steps faltered. "My pet," Hot Horse Guy murmured as he drew closer. "Excuse me?" Amy scrunched her nose. "I have followed you this great distance," he said. "I entreat you, do not abuse me further." You abused him? Gabby asked Grace. Grace squinted at him. Are you talking to me? Ah, Cherie, he pleaded, taking Grace's hand and drawing it to his lips. His kiss sent a chill up her arm, even though his hand was warm. It means, my dear, Chase whispered in Grace's ear. Pet, I can understand. Some people keep pigs as pets, but not dear. I'm not his dear or his pet. Ah, you have yet to forgive me. Hot Horse Guy held her hand pressed against his chest. It matters not. Our love is written in the stars. Ew, Grace pulled away from him. I don't know who you are or what you want. Oliver squared his shoulders and stepped in front of Grace. You heard her. Pork her off. Chase cocked his head at the scene as if trying to read the situation before also taking a protective shielding step. Yeah, you heard the sow. The sow? Grace pushed Chase and Oliver out of her way. Look, I'm sure you're a perfectly nice French person, but I'm not who you think I am. Hot Horse Guy lowered his eyebrows at Chase and Oliver. I am not afraid to fight for my heart. Chase and Oliver braced their shoulders like roosters ruffling their feathers, which was so strange because Grace didn't even know if the California boys had ever seen roosters squaring off for a fight, or even seen roosters in the flesh and feathers. Grace held out her arms, separating Chase and Oliver from Hot Horse Guy. No one is fighting anyone, she said, looking first at Oliver, then Chase. And I am not your heart, she said to Hot Horse Guy. I've slain a dragon for you, he said in a wounded tone. You mean that figuratively, right? Grace wanted to believe that this guy couldn't really believe in dragons, but the fierce look on his face made her question his sanity. What's going on? Brock's voice came from directly behind her. Grace twisted to see Brock. Alicia stood a little ways away. Gabby sent her a death stare, but Alicia refused to meet her eye. Something about the way Brock acted made Grace suspect he didn't know about Chase's and Alicia's beach hookup. This guy thinks Grace holds his heart, Amy said. If you've ever seen a real heart, you would know how creepy that sounds, Grace said, thinking of the Salmondale biology class where Dr. Holmes had dissected a cow's heart. The ringmaster's voice belted over the loudspeaker, announcing the last show. The lights flickered on as the sun settled onto Saddlehorn Mountain, preparing to completely disappear. Alicia took hold of Brock's arm. Let's go, Brocky. I don't want to miss the acrobats. They're my favorite. Amy quirked an eyebrow. Brocky? Brock glowered at her before turning to the new guy. What's your name? He stepped in front of Brock so that the toes of his boots were touching the ends of Brock's sandals. I am Roy Charmant, and who might you be? Brock swallowed a laugh. I might be Batman. You scoff at my devotion. Charmant placed a hand over his heart. No, I never scoff at devotion. I scoff at... Alicia interrupted and tugged at Brock's arm. What are you doing? Let's go. Brock pointed his finger at Roy's chest. Leave Grace alone, he said. Bafflement flickered across Roy's face. Why is he calling you Grace? Because it's my name. He cocked his head, considering her. I like it. It suits you. Grace laughed. Of course it does. If you wish to be called Grace, I understand. I'm done with this, Oliver said, draping one arm around Grace's shoulder and the other around Amy's. Let's go watch the show. That was super creepy, Oliver murmured on the way to the tent. You better stay away from him, he told Amy, or I'm telling Dad. Amy rolled her eyes. I liked him until he started talking. It's sad, really. So many people are that way. Gabby slid a look at Chase. Chase opened his mouth to make an argument, but closed it again, obviously worried that Brock would overhear him. After a few seconds of internal debate, he whispered in her ear, She started it, okay? But why? Gabby whispered. Chase shrugged. Who knows? You'll have to ask her. What, she couldn't resist your charms? Grace stopped and the line of people surged around him. Is that so hard to believe? Gabby frowned at him. I don't get it. I don't get you. You're right. You don't. Oh, come on, you guys, Amy said, pulling on Gabby. You're spoiling the circus for me. I'm sorry, Amy, Chase said, but I don't want to be here anymore. You're supposed to be helping me find the dwarfs, Grace said. Chase lifted his hands in surrender and walked away. Oliver kicked up a bit of sawdust in Gabby's direction. See what you've done? What I've done? Gabby huffed. He's the one who made out with her. She kissed him, Oliver and Amy said simultaneously, sounding for the first time like twins. But why? She's with Brock. Gabby looked on the edge of explosion. Grace wasn't interested in their drama, nor did she want to sit through a show of clowns, lion tamers, and acrobats. She wanted to confront the dwarfs, and she wanted to ask Hot Horse Guy just who he thought she was. She also wanted to know exactly who Blanche was and why everyone was looking for her. You guys go ahead without me, Grace said. I'll catch up. She pushed through the crowd, searching for one tall blonde head or 7 little bald ones, feeling a little like Alice lost in Wonderland. When she reached the stands, the lights flickered and then died with an electric sigh. The park disappeared into black. The Ferris wheels rocked, a few children began to cry, and in the distance, a coyote howled. The moon and stars did their best to shine through the marine layer blowing in from the coast. She stood stock still, listening and trying to get her bearings. All around her, children and adults stumbled in the dark, waiting for the lights to return. Someone, a tall, weaving figure in a black cape, bumped into her. Pardon, he mumbled. Grace found shelter beneath a slim maple tree and waited until her sight adjusted to the gloom. Scanning the crowd, she took note of the booth strung with inoperable lights. She couldn't see the dwarves or the guy called Charmant, but she did see a security officer, or at least someone dressed in a uniform. She moved back into the crowd and then felt someone tugging on her wrist. At first, believing there was a mistake, she said, "Excuse me," but the hand holding her didn't loosen. In the dark, she could only see the man's cloak. She tried to shake him loose, but the grip tightened and pulled her toward a crop of outbuildings. She opened her mouth to scream, but the man must have been expecting this. He shoved an apple into her mouth as he pulled her behind the restrooms. Grace tried to spit the apple out, but he just shoved it in deeper. She gagged, her nose burned and her vision blurred. Shadows loomed around her. She saw buildings, rocks, and trees. Stumbling forward, she hit her head against a building. She struggled against the pain, the apple in her mouth and the hands holding onto her wrists. But within seconds, a tide of warm lassitude spread through her and buckled her knees. She fell into the embrace of her captor. Right before she passed out, she heard, "Ah, princess, must you make everything très difficile?" Brock and Alicia stood in the line outside the big top, waiting to pass through security. Little kids with parents, college-age couples with their arms around each other's waists, senior citizens holding hands. The circus was one of those one-size-fits-all places that catered to everyone. The only people who didn't belong were loners. It wasn't like a movie theater where you could sit alone in the dark, or a bookstore where you could get lost in the aisles. Brock glanced over at Alicia. She studied her phone with a screwed-on smile on her lips. He wasn't really alone, but he felt like it. What was worse, being alone or being with someone who made you feel lonely? Besides, he hated being called Brocky. It sounded too close to broccoli, and he wondered what she'd say if he started calling her Alicia Asparagus. Brock peeked over her shoulder. She moved her phone out of sight. "Don't look." "Why not?" "Girl stuff." She edged away, her smile broadening. Alicia handed her bag to the security guard for inspection while Brock stood with his hands in his pockets, wishing he was somewhere else. He had only agreed to go to the circus because he'd heard Grace and Dillinger making plans. Brock knew he should feel guilty about this, but it didn't stop him from going. Maybe sometime between the acrobats and clowns, he'd find a way to break things off with Alicia. He slid a glance at her. She had a secret. Brock felt it hanging between them. She'd been mad that he'd taken Grace home from the beach, but there was more to it than that. In some ways, she was like the whispering painting in the attic, just another something or someone he couldn't figure out. Inside, the tent felt closed, dark and stuffy. Brock looked around and caught sight of Ashton, Clark, and Beans on the bleachers about 3 rows from the front. They waved him over. He nudged Alicia. "Let's go sit with the guys." She rolled her eyes, but somehow managed to keep them glued to her phone. "Your friends," she began. "What?" He lifted his shoulder and put her phone into her bag. "They're one-dimensional." "What does that mean?" Sighing, she placed her hand on his arm. "I love that you're a nerd. I really do. Smart is sexy, but those guys..." She wrinkled her nose as if she'd just entered a house overrun by cats. "How would you feel if I told you I didn't like Devin?" "You don't like Devin?" "Of course I like Devin. Mostly. I just wondered how you'd feel if I said I didn't." Alicia scratched her ear. "It's not the same. Devin is awesome. Your friends are... what sort of name is Bean, anyway?" knowing that telling her that Bean's family dubbed him that when he was a fat little kid with gas wouldn't help. So he said, "It's a nickname. You don't get to pick your nickname." And Ashton, he's too, what? Well, she said, he's kind of like Mount Rushmore. What does that mean? He looks great. He's super impressive, but he's hard to talk to. She found a seat 5 rows back from the center, sat down, and tugged on Brock's hand. Besides, it's nice when it's just the two of us. Brock settled beside her, disliking her and hating himself for being with her. On the other side of the ring, he caught sight of Gabby, Amy, Oliver, and Dillinger. They all wore pig suits. But they were standing, looking around as if searching for someone. Grace. She'd been with them earlier, so where was she now? Chapter 9. Grace tried to process her surroundings: a sawdust floor, rough stone walls, water tinkling, and moonlight filtering through a high window. The floor's chill crept through her pig suit. She wanted to lift her head off the ground, away from the sawdust tickling her nose and making her throat itch. But when a pair of dark boots entered her line of sight, she relaxed and played possum like dead. The toe of one boot nudged her side, and she didn't respond or flinch. A warm hand picked up her arm. She contemplated struggling, but hadn't the strength. Despite rising goosebumps, she kept her arms wet noodle limp. When the man lifted her, she tried to peek, only a little, to identify him. But her eyelids, as if they had gone into league with the man and the poison apple, wouldn't cooperate. So she slept. The next time she woke, Grace bounced down a canyon road on a velvety cushion. Rocking with each hairpin turn, she tried to form a coherent thought. Before she passed out again, the only thing that registered was the unmistakable clip-clop of horses' hooves. Sometime later, she stood with her face in drool and her head full of wool. The cushion beneath her cheek smelled like a barn and her own stinky breath. She rubbed her tongue over her gritty teeth and rolled her head back to look out the window at the stars flickering through the boughs of oak trees. An owl winged past the moon. His shadow fell on the canyon wall. Where was she? And how long had she been here? The carriage listed to one side so that her head sat lower than her feet. A thick fog blowing in from the coast billowed and puffed under a lone streetlight. Scraggly oaks and tangles of mesquite bordered the guardrail that kept the canyon foliage from spilling into the parking area. Why had they stopped? Where was the guy who had taken her? Her arms and legs felt detached from her torso, as if they belonged to someone else. She wiggled her fingers around and found they worked. She didn't try to sit up. Listening for a kidnapper, she couldn't come up with the same thought, a plan for escape, or a reason anyone would take her. The strange sense of ease flooded her body, but instead of being at peace, she grew increasingly frustrated with a sapping droopiness. She shifted her legs. They'd grown sweaty and sticky inside the costume. Suddenly, the carriage pitched as if hit. The piggy ears poked Grace's cheek, and she pulled off the headband. Clinging ran out. Twisting, she looked out the window and saw 2 men battling with swords. Charmant wore a tight black t-shirt that pulled across his chest. A tall man, presumably her kidnapper, wore a cloak and a hat with a feather. Sweat rolled down their faces, and the man who looked like Robin Hood flashed a smile, telling the world that he was enjoying himself. A beam of light glinted off a sword. Grace wanted to scream, but instead she kicked the door, and to her surprise, it caught Robin Hood guy in the groin. He doubled over. Charmant whacked him on the head with the butt of his sword, and Robin Hood dropped onto the gravel with a grunt. Roy placed his boot in the middle of the inert man's back, pointed his sword at the man's neck, cocked his head at Grace, and smiled. "Many thanks," he said. Grace struggled out of the carriage and onto her feet. "I guess I should thank you?" Her knees buckled under her own weight, and she braced herself against the carriage so she could remain upright. Roy held her gaze for a moment, the smile toying around his lips. "Let me clean this up," he said. "Don't move." She didn't think she could without falling, so obedience was a given. Roy slipped the sword into the sheath, secured to his waistband, then hauled the man to his feet. One-handed, he hoisted the man onto the back of the carriage. Grace shifted to watch while Charmant opened a large trunk secured to the back end of the carriage and folded the man into it like he was a cumbersome collection of bones and flesh. He clicked an old-fashioned lock closed and turned a skeleton key in the lock. Grace covered her mouth, hoping she wouldn't be sick. "You have to let him out." "What would you wish I'd do with him?" "He'll be perfectly safe." Grace swallowed back bile. "Cherie, the man wasn't concerned for your safety. I don't think you should worry about his." Grace tried to object. Even kidnappers shouldn't be tossed into trunks, she wanted to say. But as she pulled away from the carriage, all the blood left her head for other places. Charmant scooped her up before she could fall and placed her into the carriage. Thumping came from the trunk. No longer rolling or pitching, Grace tried to make sense of her surroundings. She felt warm and damp in her pink pig suit, and soon drifted into a strange sleep. A flash of light accompanied a sudden cool breeze that brushed over her face. Strong arms freed her, and she flew. Over a dark lawn, below the canopy of trees, she floated on her back. She didn't feel fear or surprise at being airborne. She hovered in the dark damp. A door burst open. "You got her?" a familiar, gravelly voice asked. Grace looked around as she descended onto a cot. Faint moonlight touched the faces of the 7 dwarfs. One of them stretched out a hot finger and touched her slightly parted lips, as if feeling for a breath. "She'll be all right?" a concerned voice asked. "Roy wouldn't hurt her," another voice replied. "She will be fine, but I'm afraid we've been terribly mistaken," Charmant said. "She isn't my Blanche." "No, she has to be." "Are you sure?" "Can you doubt my heart?" Charmant asked, resting his hand on his chest. "We must accept the grim reality that my love is gone and that we have made a grave error." He hung his head. Despite the obvious fact that someone had drugged and kidnapped her, and Charmant and his little friends were possibly to blame, Grace felt sorry for them. Sometime later, she woke shivering. Hot, cold, a pounding head, erratic blood coursing through her body. Her head swam when she tried to open her eyes, and the walls seemed to breathe in and out. The floor and ceiling tipped. Drenched in sweat, watching the dancing ceiling and walls, she felt faint. Her mouth tasted sour and felt dry. Grace stretched on the bed and wiggled her numb arms and legs. She still wore the costume, but the pig ears had been placed on the nightstand. She was home. But how did she get here, and what had happened? Had the kidnapping all been a horrible dream? Heather, breathing slow and deep, slept in the twin bed on the other side of the room. Her gaze landed on the aquamarine stone sitting on her nightstand. What had Brock said? Something about it being protection. Maybe if she had it with her last night, she wouldn't have been kidnapped. If she had been kidnapped. She knew how crazy that sounded, but did it really sound any crazier than being stalked by 7 dwarfs or being poisoned by an apple? Grace crawled from the bed, snagged Heather's tablet, and looked up aquamarine stones. Since the beginning of time, aquamarine stones have been held to endow the wearer with sagacity, valor, and joy. In the Middle Ages, it was thought that aquamarine would ease the efficacy of poisons. Legend claims that sailors wore the gemstones for protection. Deciding that an aquamarine stone sounded like a good thing to keep, Grace padded into her grandfather's and found a paperclip in the desk drawer. She twisted it around the stone, making sure it was secure. Back in her room, she pulled a silver chain from her jewelry box, remembering the boy, Chad someone, her 7th grade crush, who had given it to her. She threaded the end of the paperclip to the chain and promised herself that even if the legends weren't true, she would wear the stone. She liked the cool solidity of it against her skin. After her shower, she found Heather sitting on her bed with her tablet propped up in her lap. She didn't even glance at Grace. How was the circus? What would Heather say if Grace told her that she'd been kidnapped by a man wielding a sword? The whole thing seemed so much like a dream, she didn't know what was real and what was not. "Weird," she said. Heather looked up and grinned. "How so?" "Well, it was a circus." Grace let her voice trail away. A knock on the door interrupted them before Grace could decide whether or not to confide in Heather. Tobe stuck his head in. "Someone here for you," he told Grace. "It's a boy." "Did he give you a name?" "Said he lives next door." "Brock." "For some reason, he didn't think you'd be here," Tobe said. "He's giving me $1 to check on you." "Why would he think you wouldn't be here?" Heather asked, looking up from her tablet. Grace shrugged. "But now that you're home, I might not get $1, Toby said. "Tell him I'll be there in a second," Grace said, glancing in the mirror at her disheveled hair. As soon as Toby closed the door, she dropped her towel, stepped into her shredded jeans, and pulled on a bleach-splattered blue t-shirt from her drawer. She tied her hair into a knot as she headed for the front hall. Grace found Brock in the dining room with Grandma Dorothy, both working on a giant jigsaw puzzle. Brock looked up when she walked in, and relief spread over his face. "There you are," he said. standing and sending the dining room chair he'd been sitting in screeching across the hardwood. Where did you think I was? He shook his head and shrugged at the same time. Chase, Gabby, Amy, Oliver, they were all pretty upset last night when you ditched them. I guess you don't have a cell? Grace huffed out a sigh. Now, why would she need a cell phone? Grandma Dorothy asked. Most days, Grandma Dorothy wore a red flannel housecoat, a pair of knee-high socks, and fuzzy blue slippers, but today, for some reason, she decided to mix things up, and she wore Grandpa's big black robe, no socks, and pink running shoes. She did her hair once a week on Tuesdays, so by Sunday, her hair was always out of control, although it looked much better than it did on Mondays. Brock pulled out his phone to show Grace the list of texts from everyone. They're worried. Then they should have come over to check on her themselves, Grandma Dorothy said. They sent me, Brock told her. And isn't this a lot nicer than just beeping on some phone? Dorothy asked. Maybe, Grandma. Brock had better things to do than checking in on me. Cow pies, Dorothy snorted. Grandma, embarrassment washed through Grace. Well, this whole generation has lost its ability to hold a face-to-face conversation. Back in my day, if a young man had the hots for a girl, he would show up with some flowers, or even better, something sweet. She slid Brock a suggestive glance. Brock doesn't have the hots for me, Grace told her grandma. He has a girlfriend. Brock's cheeks had turned the same shade of pink as the dining room curtains. I don't care. Next time he comes over here pestering us, he better bring some chocolates if he wants to talk to you. Dorothy bent over the puzzle and refused to make eye contact. Grace took Brock's arm and led him through the French doors and out the patio. The sun skimming the trees told her it was still early. She glanced through the kitchen window and saw Jeannie setting a few plates around the table. The smell of sausage and eggs floated toward them. A wave of anger and frustration swept over Grace. Why did her grandparents think her mom should be their personal slave? I'll be sure and bring chocolates next time I come over, Brock said. Make sure they're laced with something that'll put her to sleep. He grinned. You don't mean that. Grace did not confirm or deny. I better text Dillinger. He kept mentioning the little men. He made air quotes. I don't know what that means. Chase still likes Gabby, she blurted, not sure why she thought Brock needed to know that, but it seemed really important. What makes you say that? I just know that he does. They break up and get back together faster than some people change their underwear, and by some people, I mean him. You don't like Chase? Maybe he did know about Chase, Alicia, in the beach makeout session. It was Brock's turn to neither confirm nor deny. He held out his phone. Do you want me to call them? If we don't tell them you're okay, they're going to hound me. Can you do a group text? Here, I'll send a selfie of us. He stepped beside her, put one arm around her shoulders, and used his other hand to snap their pictures. He felt warm and comforting, and for a brief moment, she thought about confiding in him, but she didn't want him or anyone else to think she was crazy, even though she probably was. Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for episode 6.